I want to get started and officially kick off the event. Again, I mentioned our opening keynote presenter is Tyronne Stoudemire. Tyronne, a little bit about him before he pops into our virtual stage. He is the Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion for Hyatt Hotels Corporation. At Hyatt Corporation, Stoudemire collaborates with the senior leadership team to implement culture, talent, and marketplace strategies that leverage diversity and inclusion globally. Previously, Tyronne served as principal in Mercer's diversity and inclusion practice. And prior to joining Mercer, Tyronne was the global head of diversity with Aon Hewitt. So please join me in welcoming Tyronne to the stage. As he pops up, I want to just go over the title for today's keynote is Transforming Awareness into Allyship, Advancing Equity and Supporting Progress in the Workplace. Thank you so much and welcome to the event. Hi, Tyronne. Welcome.
Welcome. Good morning. And thank you so much to the Opal group and the entire team for allowing me to participate in this wonderful summit. And what a great time for us to come together collectively to share best practices, share our stories, and get to know each other and learn some of the challenges that we're encountering in the workforce today. It was just changed tremendously. I'll share my slides here and we'll get started. Okay, one moment, please. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. One second. Oh, my apologies. Oh.
Thank you, Tyronne. I wanted to pop up just as you're trying to get that together and just let everyone know we have several sessions today as well. After Tyronne, we're going to be hearing from several amazing speakers, Jeff Becker with the American Management Association, Claire Herring with Blue Ocean Brain. Tennille Boyer will be hosting a panel discussion later today at 11:10 Eastern, where we're going to hear from Zimmer Biomet, Lockheed Martin, Major League Baseball. So we're very excited about today's lineup and appreciate you all bearing with us while we try to make sure that the technical side is working. As we all know, we've probably spent the entire year, last year and parts of this year on Zoom and really connecting virtually. So we'll just let Tyronne get lined up with his presentation today. And again, post your questions in real time as well.
How do we get back to? It's here.
Okay.
This is it.
Yeah. So go ahead and open up your meeting.
Tyronne, I do believe that our IT can pop up the presentation for you. Would you like Henry to do that?
Oh, we can probably do it. Just bring the presentation back up.
We have it. 1 second.
Okay. Go ahead and share. Is this where you click share it? Let me take a look. All right.
It's the second one.
Is this one? Here we go.
My apologies.
This one here?
Yes.
Should see it now.
Great.
We see it now.
We see it now. Thank you
both
so much. Allow me to really talk through today's session. You've heard the title. With so much going on in the world today, particularly around race, gender orientation, but especially with the murder of George Floyd, and understanding where we are with the systematic issues that we are plagued with on a day-to-day basis, wanted to play a video to give a sense of what does systematic racism look like, where did it start, and how do we actually overcome that today. So I would ask the attorney to please play the video.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
We all have a role in putting this back together collectively. There is no one size fits all. There is no, there's multiple opportunities for us to help one another. There is no elevator to success in this space. This is all about taking the next slide here so we can get back to the presentation. Share. It's really that it's going to take there was no elevator to success, and it's important that we take small steps. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to resolve this issue overnight. So it's taking time to get people to meet them where they are and to move up. Most of us operate in our corporate environments so that we're fair and equitable to all from an equality perspective. But now we have to meet people where we are. Just as we saw in the video, the difference between a Black student versus a white student, meeting people where they are, giving them the tools to be successful. Because the world in which we live has changed tremendously. The business imperative for diversity is that the United States workforce is more than 39% non-white. It will be 50% non-white by 2040. Women will make more than 80% of travel decisions in my environment, hotel. 80% of our decisions are made for women, but our target audience, in most cases who we communicate with and advertise to, are the heterosexual white male business travel. By 2035, nearly 20% of China's population will be aged at 65. This is a global issue for individuals. How do you exit people out of the organization? How do you bring them into the organization? And how do you not create compression issues because you can't age people out of the systems for multiple reasons? Nearly 40% of our workers will be Hispanic, African American, and Asian by 2025. So most organizations today are now looking 5 years out, or technically 4 years now, to determine what do my workforce need to look like in order to be successful. And quite frankly, those who do not diversify will not be around. As we continue to look at these different statistics, as we talk about the imperatives of diversity, then this is imperative for diversity. Data is king. So nothing speaks louder than zero. And I think we have to make sure that the data doesn't lie. We have to follow those statistics. As we continue to look at why we care for diversity, is that embedding diversity, inclusion, into strategy, we look at it in three different components. Is what the marketplace is, what we sell, the impacts on our products and our services, the talent, who does the work? So how we engage, retain, and advance talent, and then how do we run our business from a culture perspective and the impact on internal systems and processes? Are we looking at all these processes with a different lens to control for the bias that we may have? What we did 50 years ago is not relevant today. Quite frankly, what we did last year won't be relevant for this year going on. So we have to evaluate and take an audit of all of these systems to ensure we're controlling for the bias that lies there. Then we want to talk about the three different components: the workforce, the workplace, the marketplace. Where you recruit, where's the talent coming in at? The whole information that we now see that in urban communities and community colleges are producing a tremendous amount of talent who may have not qualified for a major university, couldn't afford it, or whatever reason is there. That talent sits there that's being untapped. Recently with the United States, and we saw that the influx of leaders today in city, state, and government, Kamala Harris, who's our new vice president, comes from Howard University, historical Black college. The mayor of Atlanta and Stacey Abrams comes from Spelman College, another historical Black colleges. You're starting to see talent rise up from these universities that have been overlooked over the last years. We talk about education and advocacy and communications. In our workforce, there's an imperative that we communicate more now than we've ever communicated before. Messages that are sent from our CEOs and our executives have to be more inclusive to foster a more inclusive and caring culture for our colleagues. We talk about the evolution of diversity. Next, I'll walk you through, but how we be able to harness the diverse workforce is critical to our success. The marketplace, particularly from a global branding perspective, is how we reach beyond the borders to make sure that we're reaching in and partnering with the right strategic partners to grow our business, that we're expanding supplier diversity, that we're helping to grow women and minority-owned businesses. And I really catch myself with minority. I try not to use that word because it's a mathematical equation that means less than. So I really want to replace that with people of color. Women and people of color, and how do we help them to grow from a supplier perspective, an investor's perspective, and how we involve our business. I think it's important that we talk about the evolution of diversity, particularly in the United States. And it really started with compliance in 1964 to 1998. It was about being compliant with the law. Because of the civil rights movement and equal opportunities, people began to what I call bean counting. Give me 2 women, 3 Latinos, 4 Asians, a few Black men, and a few good white men and women, we will be okay, right? And that didn't really give us what we were looking for, because people were hired because of their race and gender, was never really given a sense of being called what we called non-qualified workers, right? That was some of the perceptions that were out there for many. And then because the workforce was so different and diverse, in 1989 to 1995, we created what we call the sensitivity and awareness training. So many of your traditionalists and your baby boomers who went through this training, white men walked out of the training with white guilt. I get it. I'm holding people back. I don't understand how to harness this workforce. I'm not accustomed to working with this much diversity. Women and people of color walked away from the training with, I'll never break the glass ceiling. I'll never get ahead. And this tolerance and sensitivity training, what it did was taught us how to tolerate one another. Who wants to be tolerated? I'll tolerate that you're Black. I tolerate that you're white, tolerate you're gay, straight. But at the end of the day, I want you to go away. It did not have the effect. And what it created was polarization. 1996 to 2010, everybody focused on the business case, particularly business to consumer driven products, right? To consumers wanted to make sure they harnessed the market share, who was buying their products. We began to look at their commercials, how they advertise, how they're packaged, and where they show up to ensure that they were reaching their goals as relates to their spending and buying power of those different demographics. And now we're talking about how do we sustain to get sustainability for the future. With the death and murder of George Floyd shown us, coupled with the pandemic and COVID-19, the disenfranchised groups such as the Black and Brown communities in healthcare, in jobs, in opportunities, essential workers, all those things were surfaced in this last year, and we're looking for strategies to move forward. Even virtual workers, we're now working virtually. This session would have been live, and we'd have been able to network and have conversations and pat each other on the back and slap a high five, if you will. But those things have gone away. Now we find a different way to communicate and get work done. So I wanted to really talk about the evolution and how it continues to evolve. For those of you who may understand, when do we get this done? Why do we have the same conversations? We didn't get it overnight. It's going to take some time for us to move on. We've moved from a moment. This is a movement to be able to move them more inclusive. And I'm a firm believer that if we solve for one, it benefits all of us. Let's talk about the impact on diversity teams. And so some research was done, because I really like to lead with the evidence-based diversity strategy, looking at the data, looking at the research that's there for us. So Dr. Adler did some research on high-performing teams and low-performing teams, a monocultural team, and she saw the difference between the two. Now, I'm not going to spend time on an average performing team because no one wants to be average. Everybody wants to be high-performing. You can have a very high-performing team and be very homogeneous, but the world is changing and evolving. The workforce looks very different. No company will have a homogeneous, all men, all women, all whites, all Blacks. It has to be some integration. The difference between the two is a leader that ignores or suppress the cultural differences on his or her team will not get good results. Those who actually harness, leverage, and value those differences. And I say leverage for a reason. It's not managing the diversity, it's leveraging the diversity. Understanding that I, as a Black male, have a set of skills and competencies to do things differently than that of someone else. Dimensional diversity goes beyond race and gender and orientation. It talks about we've also acquired. We acquire education. We acquire time, marriage status. We acquire unions of families and those things. So it evolved again over time. So what's the solution? I believe that cross-cultural competence is one of the top 10 requirements, top 10 competencies required to do business in a global economy. I define cross-cultural competence as the ability to discern and take into account one's own and other worldviews, to care with empathy, and to be able to seize opportunities to make decisions, resolve conflicts that optimize cultural differences for better, long-lasting, and more creative solutions to outperform the competition. We're moving from tolerance and sensitivity to cross-cultural competence, from attitudes to behaviors. In order to drive sustainable change in an organization, it's behavioral change. Now, let me be very clear. Many of you that are in HR or in talent acquisition or diversity know that culture will eat strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it's really how do you change the behavior of the organization rooted in your values and your purpose. Hyatt is a purpose-driven organization. Our purpose is to care for people to be their best. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is the manifestation of our purpose. But Tyronne, how do you measure this? So we use a survey to really look at, it's called the Intercultural Development Inventory by Dr. Mitch Hammer. And the survey really looks at how sensitive we are to other cultures. I'll walk you through the dimensions. It moves from a monocultural mindset, which we all live in from day to day, to a global mindset. And it's developmental over time. The broader our worldview, the more likely that we have different perspectives from different cultures and different backgrounds and different parts of society. The continuum begins with denial. Denial is, I understand there's other cultures and I understand there's other backgrounds, but I have a tendency to suppress, ignore, or withdraw. Next on the continuum is actually orientation is polarization. And polarization is an orientation of judgment, them versus us, of one up and one down. It actually takes on two different forms. The first form, I am defensive because my culture is better than yours. I am the primary culture. And then it's the reversal. I'm reverting from my primary culture for another culture. Individuals, we saw this behavior during the murder of George Floyd, where you saw the young digital native who stood on the corner with an iPhone and showed the entire world the injustice between black and white, citizens and police officers, where George Floyd was murdered in the middle of the street, caused people to stop, to look, to listen, and to assess, and they began to advocate, even though they were from a different background. When we saw the protesters, it was probably in my lifetime the most diverse I've ever seen. You had blacks, white, Latino, Asian, young, old, gay, straight, people with disabilities, veterans, were all marching for the common goal. And then there's minimization. Minimization is orientation that we're more similar than we are different. 70% of global culture sits in minimization. People will say things like, I am not a racist. My best friend is black. I vacation with someone that's gay, right? My wife, I love women, I married one, right? They began to minimize the other, but thinking with good intentions that I'm trying to celebrate, but to that other person, I never knew I was just your black friend. I thought I was just your friend. Then it's acceptance. I accept, I leverage and value. I am not gay, but I'm a strong advocate for the gay community. I believe and I want to support and I advocate and I'll march and support and I'm accepting for who they are and what they and how they want to live. And I want to make sure they live and care for it to be their best. And then it's adaptation. Adaptation is an orientation. I routinely shift my behaviors to adapt to the cultures at hand. These are individuals who move beyond Taco Tuesday and Fried Rice Friday and really immerse themselves into the other culture by learning the language, by dressing in the garb, by taking the values and making sure those values are integrated into their values. That is adaptation. So it's from denial to adaptation. And the survey is really great because it looks at how you perceive yourself and then what your development orientation is. This particular person perceives themselves pretty much on the cusp of adaptation, but all due respect, after the survey controlling for the differences, it shows that they're really above minimization. Right, so they're within the global benchmark because we live in this place of minimization. We live that difference is bad. You go back to your most informative years between 5 and 8, and those who have children or those who were raised by parents, when we saw difference, we did what? We stared. And we were told that it's not polite to stare. We saw someone that was homeless or someone in a wheelchair. And in that regard, we were told, sweetie, it's not polite to stare. And we were told it was wrong, it was different. When kids begin to see difference, they have that ability. When we interact with individuals from other cultures, and English is not the first language, and they began to try to translate, and we do what? We speak louder. Can't you hear the words that are coming out of my mouth? And it's not that they can't hear, they're trying to translate from another language and to be polite. We also assume that they're slower, that they're not as smart, right? We make assumptions and judgments for those individuals because of their differences. And as we continue to evolve from a global culture perspective, we are going to have to be more sensitive and aware of these types of issues and have the right tools to navigate appropriately. So the survey looks at your individual assessment, but also what I like is your group profile. As a team, a sample size of 9 individuals, they're dispersed between polarization all the way through acceptance. So now I can actually provide some learning opportunities for individuals to understand what it means to be accepted, how I'm being treated when I'm being minimized, and what polarization looks like. You have now language, you have orientations, you have behaviors that moves us beyond race and gender and know that there's other dimensions of diversity that we have to solve for. And the goal should be moving beyond minimization into acceptance. Now that's how you look at an individual and a group. Let's talk about the organization. So looking at the maturity and the importance of diversity strategy, and as a global company, I have to look at this across the spectrum from 1 to 5, 5 being the greatest. How do your colleagues and employees feel as it relates to the importance and the maturity of the diversity? So it's a focus group, it's a survey, and then you look for the delta and close the gap. That's one way of being assessed just how important it is. And this is work of Gartner that we actually partner with. And then I would talk about an audit. I think after the murder of George Floyd and the imbalance in corporate America, we began to look at our talent acquisition processes and our development processes and worked with an organization called Have Her Back. And they've done an audit where we reviewed our talent practices, We vetted the talent practices with the owners. We then conducted interviews with the executive committee, diversity committee, some subgroups, and then we had added to hear from our Black colleagues and our other DBRGs to make sure that we have a good mix, and then creating a presentation, a summary, and an action plan to move forward. I would encourage all of you to take a time and a moment in time and evaluate your practices and to control for those differences that may be there, that has been overlooked or have been under-recognized. One thing for us is that our job descriptions, we're now evaluating what's required to do the function. And oftentimes we describe them and it's so big and so broad, you can't find the right person to meet the needs of that particular role. And in some cases, individuals who are sitting around the table making decisions couldn't do the job either. So again, evaluating those things that were put in place could be barriers. Then we really want to talk about how the objectives of creating what's necessary to be successful, how we look at the workflow to determine where we're going, and then looking at our goals. And then last but not least, I want you to look at what to look at from a talent perspective. In order to figure out where the talent sits, you want to look at it by levels in the organizations, right? So looking at all levels, looking at gender, looking at race. And as you can see, the higher up you go in the organization, the less you see that of females. Starting with more females that most companies in my consulting days when I did this work, hired women and people of color at a much faster rate. However, they were leaving at a fast rate because of lack of promotions up into the organization. This is a sample of a guide, not really relevant to anyone, but some of the data there. And then you look at how do you then project, if we look at how we hire, how we promote, and advance with the organization, we can forecast how long it will take us to reach parity. So this is another tool we use as an example to be able to forecast the levels of the organization. So making this a conscious effort, adults learn from an aha moment, they get feedback, they're able to self-correct. The goal is to influence others and to influence systems. So at the end of the day, I think collectively, as we look at all these processes, as we create an opportunity for people to see difference, as we help people to understand and get feedback, and then be able to self-correct and say, I grew up in a rural town where there was no diversity. I lived in an area where I didn't see people of color. I didn't interact. That concludes my presentation today. I want to open up for any questions that you may have. I think I just lost the connection that came back. I would like to open up for if there's any questions that we may have.
Hi, Tyronne. I am just popping back in quick. I don't believe we have any just yet. Or actually, let me just double check for you briefly. We do have a couple of minutes until our next keynote is going to take to the stage. I would like to ask, how do you engage leaders? Oh, this is a good one. How do you engage leaders in the dialogue of DE&I?
That's a very good question. And we start by the results of this survey. And once we determine where a leader sits on that, and we also get the engagement survey, we look at the turnover, the promotion rates of that particular leader to have an in-depth and evidence-based conversation. And oftentimes people really want to do the right thing. They just don't know how. And this is a moment that all leaders will have to be more vulnerable, right? As they do this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion to show, that they may not be aware of another culture or a different background. We have to provide what I call psychological safety, where people can be themselves and ask questions that historically they won't ask.
Oh, thank you for sharing, Tyronne. A couple that just came in, specific to your presentation. What firm did you use for the talent audit? And then what was the name, of the audit company?
Yeah. So it's a women-owned business. It's called Have Her Back. And it is a group of women who have come together, who have worked in corporate America, from communications to CHRO to diversity to engagement survey, to build a business to help advance diversity within the workplace. It's called Have Her Back. You can Google them. Wonderful organization.
Oh, wow. And easy to remember. It's a great name. Thank you, Tyronne. We'll squeeze in one more here before we start. How do you leverage diversity business resource groups?
That's, again, another good question, and really sometimes unserved group. We've embedded diversity business resource groups into our diversity strategy and our business strategy. They look at the workforce, so they help us to recruit, where they go on campus recruiting. They own that relationship. They involve with the youth. We have them involved with our sales channel. We've done, from a travel perspective, the Pride community will spend $1.3 trillion in travel. The Black community, $69 billion in travel. Women will spend more than anyone in travel, right? So how do we then leverage those groups to work very closely with historical Black colleges, to work with League of Black Women, or to work with other women organizations or pride groups like HRC? We want to make sure we're working with them to be able to grow our travel business. So they come in from that perspective, and from an onboarding perspective, helping people to feel connected to someone that's like me is a great way to have a nice onboarding process.
Certainly, certainly. Well, thank you, Tyronne. I believe we're at time. We have a few other questions that have come in, so I'll send those your way, Tyronne, so at least you can be able to answer those. And we're happy to share the answers with the audience as well. For now, I'd love to keep us on time with our next presentation. Thank you so much, Tyronne. And again, we'll send you the questions that are coming in. So I wish you a great rest of your day, and I hope that you join us for some other sessions later today.
Absolutely. I wish everyone all the best. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Tyronne.
Bye.